It's dark, it's just after lunch, we're overrunning, and I'm going to talk about Birmingham. My hometown is justly proud of having the highest proportion of trees to people of any major European city. And less justly, because it's actually much larger than Venice, of having more miles of canals than Venice. It also probably has, proportionately, the highest number of castellations, arches and turrets on domestic architecture of any British urban conurbation. Arts and crafts architecture, essentially aping the style of the Middle Ages, transformed Birmingham's late 19th century suburbs at the same time as its great factories and workshops transformed its industrial core. Superficially contradictory, it takes only a moment's thought to realise that the houses were like they were because the factories were like they were. The great Birmingham pre-Raphaelite Edward Burne-Jones was asked why he painted not the world around him, but the world of biblical and mythic imagination. His response was simple: the more factories they build, the more angels I will paint. In other words, artists define their craft not just in response to their own sensibility, taste, ambition and desires, but in response, in this case, in opposition to the culture around them. The concepts we're invited to see as eternal and immutable are all relative. What I've been asked to talk about, the concept of excellence in the arts, has emerged as a stated priority in Brian McMaster's report to the Department for Culture, Media and Sport and elsewhere, not because people were happy with mediocre work before, but because of changes in the wider culture. The danger for me, and Jonathan's referred to this already, is that a necessary corrective to social instrumentalism in the arts is seen as an incontestable theological judgment, that an important baby is thrown out with the bathwater and the real opportunities that the McMaster report provides are missed. I think we're probably undergoing a sea change in national arts policy, an attempt not for the first time to shift power from one set of stakeholders to another, or rather to shift it back. To explain this, I need myself to shift back to the foundation of the Arts Council in the late 40s. As Tessa Jowl pointed out in a paper I'll refer to later, the early Arts Council had a definite ideology. Its purpose was absolutely and statedly to preserve elite art forms that were thought to be in danger as popular culture and mass media developed. Put another way, it was there to defend the patrician principles of high art, art's role as ennobling, its realm the nation, its organisational form the great institution, its repertoire the established canon and works aspiring to join it, including the high avant-garde, against populism. Art's primary purpose is entertainment, its realm the marketplace, its form the business, its audience mass. Hence the ringing declaration of the Arts Council's first chairman, John Maynard Keynes: death to Hollywood. Over the next 30 years, this patrician, top-down, elitist view of the arts came under attack, but not from the populist marketplace, but from a third force: artists who were artistically and often politically oppositional, many of whom had learnt their craft in the burgeoning community sector of the 60s and 70s. In the subsidised theatre in the late 50s, on television during the Hugh Carlton Green era in the early to mid-60s, and pretty much everywhere from 1968, the patrician institutions were under siege from self-consciously oppositional, alternative, provocative artists. By the mid-70s, indeed, many of those institutions have been transformed by provocative writers, directors, painters and musicians who had begun their careers in various forms of alternative art and who had now taken over the asylum. However, what both the patrician and the provocative shared was a lack of interest in the audience. George Devine was famously contemptuous of what he called the fashionable arseholes who made up his Royal Court audience during its golden period. For my generation of playwrights in the late 60s, the audience were there to be outraged and offended. As Howard Brenton put it, I want to piss in their eyeballs. And as opera director David Pountney noted, contemporary opera composers were all too willing to dismiss their audiences as conservative or lazy when their operas failed to attract a popular audience. What happened in 1979 in culture, as in all spheres of life, was a power shift from the producer to the consumer. Margaret Thatcher's great political insight was that she could use the marketplace to achieve essentially political objectives. As she herself put it, economics are the method, the object is to change the heart and soul of the nation. In the cultural sphere, she sought to counter the opposition, not by diktat, but by letting the market rip. True, at the outset there was some loose talk among Tory arts ministers about the market as promoting artistic freedom and pluralism. But by 1987, her then arts minister was speaking of the market not as a liberator, but as a policeman, insisting that the only real test of our ability to succeed is whether or not we can attract enough customers. So, like passengers, patients and parents, arts patrons became customers. And as a result, the challenge to the major national arts institutions no longer came from political playwrights or performance artists or squeaky-gate composers, but from the demands of the audience. The first effect of this was on the high avant-garde. People were no longer prepared to accept that if they didn't understand something, it was somehow their fault. Then new populist forms emerged to meet the demand, from Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals via the Three Tenors to Raymond Goubet's pop opera. Virtually across the board, from the novel via television drama all the way to Tracy Emin, there was a renewal of narrative, that most user-friendly of all artistic tools. Finally, the market demanded and the arts delivered a set of cultural forms that fulfilled Mrs. Thatcher's dearest ambitions. Popular in form, patrician in content, the heritage industry was cultural Thatcherism. As the then Secretary of State Virginia Bottomley said in May 1996, the British film industry should act as a standard bearer to promote our country, our cultural heritage, and our tourist trade. The response of the arts community to all of this was mixed. Of course, there were those in the industry, like Peter Hall at the National, who roundly and boldly defended the patrician principles of the 60s and 70s. But the political response of the Labour Party, out of office nationally, but increasingly in command of big cities with big arts budgets, was more nuanced. First of all, it was attracted to the employment opportunities of seeing the arts as a business. The cultural sector was born. Then, noting that the main target of Thatcherite arts policy was the great patrician institutions, left-wing councils saw the possibility of a popular, provocative alliance, which would collapse the traditional high art, popular art divide by expanding culture to embrace not just the electronic arts, but fashion, advertising, design and sport, on the impeccably progressive grounds of cultural democracy. So, Labour's 1992 election culture statement challenged the high art popular divide, and its 1997 statement celebrated the economic value of the cultural industries. But the most comprehensive statement was made by its first culture secretary, Chris Smith, in his 1998 book, Creative Britain, which listed the 4 key themes of arts policy, and we've heard these words before today, as access, excellence, education, and economic value. The first, third, and fourth of which can be seen as instrumental, going on to celebrate the role of artists in cementing community identity, drawing people together, and overcoming isolation and rejection. This argument was echoed, if not expanded, by the new Arts Council chair, Jerry Robinson, in a 1998 lecture in which he celebrated the role of the arts in urban rejuvenation, social inclusion, reskilling, strategies for disablement, and even healthcare. For both Smith and Robinson, the key constituent was the audience, the key purpose social, and the key policy access. As this access was not just for audiences, but also for practitioners, you could, I think, justly sum up New Labour cultural policy in this period as participatory. Participation is a real alternative to heritage and populism. It's reminded critics that the purpose of public support for the arts is not to subsidise production, but to widen consumption. It's had dramatic results. notably making museum entrances free, but also in sustaining a culture in which every great institution feels obliged to find and sustain new audiences, which was, amid all the brouhaha, Margaret Hodges' point about the proms. Its belief in accessibility made it popular, its social purpose stopped it being merely populist. The achievements of participatory art were assessed, measured and celebrated in Jamie Cowling's 2004 study for the Institute for Public Policy Review, For Art's Sake, in which he and his 7 contributors, ranging from the Secretary-General of the Arts Council to the Director of Resettlement in the Prison Service, trumpeted the achievement of the arts in engaging socially excluded groups and engaging wider audiences.